Welcome everyone to another ChessLecture.com video presentation. My name is International Master William Pascal. It's my pleasure to bring you the third part of my series, a secret opening weapon for black against 1d4. We've been focusing on the Blumenfeld gambit for black, one particular variation that I've called, or perhaps we should say coined, the Havashi variation. After the moves d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, c5, white plays d5, the most aggressive and testing move. And here we play b5. Now, a little side note, an interesting move order you might want to try to avoid the accepted form of the Blumenfeld. Well, this will give white other options, but we should consider this. Just a little sidebar. It's possible to play in Benoni fashion with 4 e takes d, c takes d, b5. This would lead to a different kind of position, but it's plausible and should be investigated. But going back to our main focus, we're going to play b5 straight away, and we're going into the Blumenfeld declined with bishop g5. We've seen this in our first two parts of the series. There's a lot to learn here, so many parts of the series are going to be coming after this one. We're really just in the beginning stages of our opening survey here. Bishop g5, e takes d5, the characteristic move of the Havashi variation. Other moves are possible, of course. h6, queen a5 check was long considered the main line. C takes d5, and d6. Now we're starting to look at the main move here, e4, virtually forcing black to play the flexible move a6, rather than, of course, pushing the pawn forward. When we're playing this pawn structure with the pawns on c5 and b5, be wary that those pawns are best placed where they are for the time being. They control a lot of squares, and if you move them forward, for example, if you push forward with c4, you create a hole at d4. If you push forward with b4, you create a hole at c4. So those pawns are best left where they are until you're sure you're ready to make an aggressive move forward with one of them. But they are a very strong factor in this opening and an advantage for black. Getting b5 in the Benoni structure is an advantageous thing for black. So that's one of the things you have going for you. Today we're going to focus not on the main line a4, but on another move which was played against me recently in a rapid game. National Master Samuelson from the United States played this move against me unknowing of any theory. And this, I think, is the kind of move that really that's going to happen a lot. You're going to find a lot of players who aren't prepared for the Blumenfeld, and that's one of the reasons we're playing this opening. And when they're unprepared for it, they're going to make natural moves. And bishop to d3 is one of those so-called natural moves. It's a good move, in my opinion. Really ironic statistics I want to run by you. As of my game, I've checked in all the major databases and correspondence databases, including my recent rapid game. Only 9 games have yet reached this position that have officially been recorded. Now, the most striking thing about this fact that only 9 games with bishop to d3 have been recorded in history is that white did not win a single one. And that is, for my mind, unbelievable, because this is a perfectly good move. It makes sense in the Benoni. To put the bishop on d3 is a very popular setup there. Here, it's also the most obvious and logical move. Nothing wrong with this simple developing move. a4, I guess, is better because it undermines black's strong queen side. We look at the position, the advantages of playing a4, forcing black to try to force black to break up his strong-looking and flexible queen side. So bishop d3 not as perhaps not as combative as a4, but certainly not to be underestimated. And it was played in some recent important games by strong players. Now, did these guys play this move by accident? I don't think so. So let's look at where this game was really played in some important games. The first game we're going to take a look at is Grandmaster Alexander Onishuk, current U.S. champion, against one of our heroes of the Blumenfeld defense, Grandmaster Gayam Megami of Iran. So this was Onishuk Gayam from 2004, the 36th Chess Olympiad in 2004. Let's follow a little bit of that game. Now, Onishuk should have been prepared, but at that point, I'm sure Gayam was playing more than one thing, but let's see what happened here. One possibility is for black to play the move bishop to g4. This would be very, very early, but it has been played in one or two games. I like Gayam's approach, and this is what we're going to consider our main line, bishop e7, developing move. The argument for playing an early bishop g4 is that you might get caught off by white playing an h3 move early. But it's not really a problem right away. Let's take a look at bishop e7. I think that's the best move. Not necessary quite yet to play bishop to g4. So Onishuk against Gayam Megami. Here we see bishop e7, and now the move that my opponent played, Samuelson repeated this, bishop f4. 9 bishop f4. This might really seem like a strange move. Moving the same piece again. But there's a couple principles in play here, tactical and strategic. First of all, there's a tactical threat that black has this knight takes d5 trick, often in this variation. So if white simply castles, knight takes d5 is a tactical trick, the idea being that if e takes d5, bishop takes g5, so e takes d5, bishop takes g5, black wins a pawn, and that's usually quite favorable. Even if white manages to trap the black king in the center, something like rook e1 check, although bishop e7 might be okay, even king f8 is fine. So we've netted a pawn in that kind of position. That's quite good. But going back to the actual game, our first game, Onishuk versus Gayam, the other idea behind bishop f4 is a common Benoni idea. Keep black bottled up. Make sure black doesn't trade any pieces. So besides the tactical factor of knight takes d5, it's important just to avoid the exchange of bishops in general. And put pressure. Bishop f4 is nice because it puts pressure on d6. So avoiding piece trades and avoiding tactics. Let's ask ourselves another question. What if white castles? Can black do knight takes d5? If castles knight takes d5, I wasn't sure about this because of bishop takes b5 check. But actually the position, although it may be slightly favorable for white, turns out to be nothing spectacular. After bishop takes b5, black may be okay. A takes b5. I analyzed this a little bit with the assistance of a computer. Queen takes d5, and now a very important move, rook a5, which may seem strange, but we're preempting knight to c3 by protecting the b5 pawn. After something like bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, although white has pressure on d6, black has pressure on e4. I'm not convinced that black is fully equal here, but I'm also not convinced that black is in any great danger either. So that's one option. You might be able to play knight takes d5 in that position. In any case, you can simply castle and threaten to play knight takes d5, which would likely transpose to the game, Onishuk versus Gayam Megami, which was the first game between really strong players where this position was tested. After bishop e7, Onishuk played bishop f4. And ironically enough, this is what my opponent, National Master Samuelson, played against me. So if a National Master can find the concept of bishop d3 and bishop f4 in a rapid play game over the board, then, it's pretty logical. I mean, this is not a long game. My opponent, a strong 2200 level player, found this move very quickly. So this is something you could fully expect to find across the board from you if you play the system, even against an opponent who's not booked up. After bishop f4, here I think I made a major inaccuracy. I should have played like Grandmaster Gaiam played. And after him, also this was repeated in the game Yermolinsky versus Christensen from the 2005 U.S. Championship, or rather 2006 U.S. Championship, Yermolinsky-Christensen was another game that followed the same order of moves. Quickly, I'm going to explain why bishop g4 is better than castles, the move I played. My move against National Master Samuelson was inferior, I believe, because white can play h3, a move that goes hand in hand with bishop d3 in the normal Benoni, since the bishop's not on e2 to break the pin against the knight on f3. h3 and bishop d3 often go hand in hand. So I think in the future I'm going to recommend not castling as I did in my game, but playing bishop g4 as Grandmaster Gaiam played against Onishuk. That's our main feature game. Now, the game continued bishop g4, knight on b to d2. And I like this move. The knights look a little bit redundant, but the knight on d2 cannot be hit by an advanced b4. It's not a target. We can naturally recapture with the knight on f3 rather than with the queen, which can sometimes be awkward. One thing you have to ask is, what about h3? Well, I think that black has two options here. It's not ridiculous to give up the bishop. With bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and knight on b to d7. As frequently done in the Benoni, black gives up the white squared bishop to free his position and focuses on dark squared play. Primarily, black is interested in the e5 square. Sometimes one knight will revolve into e5, the other back to d7, and perhaps something like bishop to f6. Black gets a solid play on the dark squares. The other possibility is bishop h5, provoking perhaps an early g4, which may be a little weakening for white. So you have either option available there. I think knight on b to d2, as played by Onishuk, is the better move. Knight on b to d7. And now we branch into two different games. Okay, here at this point we're going to focus on two games now, Onishuk versus Gaiam and Yermolinsky versus Christensen, both which reached this position. White here playing a different move, however, in either game. In our game, Onishuk versus Gaiam Megami, white in this position played castles, and that's fine, but it gives black the chance to play this active move, knight e5, and I think that is a really good plan for black. However, Onishuk's reaction was not correct. And be prepared for your opponents to do this. This is very, very likely to happen and bad for white, in my opinion. Bishop takes e5 was played by Grandmaster Onishuk. This, I think, is a very, very bad move because white has no dark squared bishop, and his central pawns are locked on the white squares. So he has a certain weakness around the dark squares, like f4, d4, c5. A large complex of dark squares are rather weak. So I do not like this exchange for white, and I think that Grandmaster Onishuk should have played the simple retreating move bishop e2, and for white this should preserve a slight advantage. After bishop to e2, black's best is probably knight g6, hitting the loose bishop on f4. Now white has to be careful where to go. If bishop g3, we can play knight h5 and trade off that dangerous and strong dark squared bishop. Instead of that, bishop e3 would be correct, when most likely black should castle, and white has several different possibilities. I assess this position as very slightly favorable for white because black has been unable to achieve the exchanges that you would like to see, at least one minor piece in this kind of position. Here white can play either h3, when black should probably back off with bishop to d7, or, alternatively, white can play knight e1, when black has a choice, but probably best is strategically relieving the spatial pressure by exchanging pieces. And after bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, something like rook e8 with the idea of bishop back to f8 to put pressure on the center followed by something like queen to d7. Black has a nice solid pawn on c5, a solid pawn on b5. Remember, these pawns take a lot of squares away from white. I think white is a little bit better because of his strong pawn island. 5-pawn island, h2, g2, f2, e4, d5. Slightly better position for white. Normal opening advantage. Once again, I want to stress that I think the bishop d3 move is not played as frequently as it deserves to be played. A solid positional line for white. Let's go back and see what happened in our actual game. So Onischuk versus Guy Yamagami. Onischuk made the mistake of playing bishop takes e5. I think this yields no advantage. I would rather play black at this point after the serious positional concession. Bishop takes e5. From Onischuk, we see d takes e5, and now Onischuk played b3, obviously concerned that black would play c4, and c4 not only pushing the white bishop away, but giving black a great diagonal on c5, a7, f2 for his dark squared bishop. So b3 was more or less essential to prevent black's bishop from becoming very strong. And here I think black should have played bishop d6, thus securing the e5 pawn. In that case, after bishop d6, h3, black can keep the pieces on the board with either bishop h5 or perhaps even going back to d7. Now I really like black with the two bishops. I think black has a slight upper hand here. But Gayam cooperated and settled for equality in his game against Onischuk. After b3, he simply castled, going back a move, castles, leaving his e5 pawn unprotected, unfortunately. This just allows the game to peter out. Onischuk played h3 with the idea that if bishop h5, g4, look at that, bishop h5, g4, and now the knight will take on e5. And although white is weak in his kingside, I don't think it's significant enough to compensate for the loss of that pawn. So Gayam simply exchanged on f3. And after bishop takes f3, we have opposite colored bishops, two grandmasters who, at this point, would probably agree the position can be assessed as roughly equal. Bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, bishop to d6. Again, I would have preferred to keep the two bishops on for Grandmaster Gayam, but in this Olympic tournament, I think he was probably satisfied to get a draw with black against the higher rated player. The game went on for about 30 moves and ended in a draw. But again, I think improvements were clearly possible for both sides in that game. So let's take a look now at Christensen playing black against Yermolinsky from the 2006 U.S. Championship. Different move order in this game. A different game altogether, actually. Instead of castling, after knight on b to d7, Yermolinsky played a simply natural move, h3. I like this move, h3, putting the question to the bishop. And I think once white has played knight on b to d2, it's not so appealing to play bishop takes f3, because it's simply replaced by another knight on f3. So I think Christensen was correct to play the move bishop h5, keeping the tension. Solid positional player like Yermolinsky is not going to be one to go for an early g4, although some people might try it. I think it's a little bit risky to play g4, considering that black hasn't castled yet. So Yermo just castled, and now Christensen castles. Both sides castled g4. Again, not so appealing, although possible. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Again, a variation that I'm not offering any guaranteed equality. I think this variation is underestimated for white and can offer him a slight advantage. After castles, Yermo played b3, a similar move to what Grandmaster Onischuk played, but I think Yermo has improved his position by not having to give up his dark squared bishop. And at this point, Grandmaster Christensen plays the move rook to c8. Rook to c8. Hard to say what black should play here. Rook c8 looks reasonable. The game continues. After rook c8, rook e1, Yermolinsky also, by the way, masterful player of the bishop d3 variation. of the Benoni. So it's no coincidence he's familiar with this piece configuration. Rook e1, another classic idea, gives white retreats, bishop back to f1 sometimes, knight maneuvers to f1 sometimes, and an original maneuver to f1 in this game you're going to see. Rook e1 supporting future e5 advances. So now we see Christensen a little bit tied up. Classic kind of problem. We've been unable to exchange any pieces. After rook e1, Larry plays rook e8, preparing bishop f8. This is a classic drop back. And the rook will be able to exert pressure along the e file. I think white is slightly better here. Again, normal opening advantage. Rook e8. White plays a strong move now. a4, trying to get a grip on those white squares. Classic positional concept. Happens sometimes in some variations of the Lopez, which this formation is similar to a Lopez or Spanish game. If the bishop is locked out on h5, far away from the queen side, look how black is having a hard time protecting those white squares. So a4, while the cat's away, the mice will play. a4 putting pressure on the white squares. Larry tries to patch it up with queen to b6. Again, Yermolinsky Christensen from the 2006 U.S. Championship, and our Havashi variation with bishop d3. Yermolinsky increases the pressure with a nice solid move, queen e2, putting pressure on the white squares, trying to get Grandmaster Christensen to give up the c4 square especially. Either pushing or trading on a4 will both weaken a6 and give up the c4 square. Christensen here relies on a little tactic. Bishop f8, a good retreat anyway. After bishop f8, black is threatening knight takes d5, a classic trick in this variation we've seen many times. And here at this point, after bishop to f8, queen f1. What an original move. Perfect retreat for the queen. Allowing the rook to protect e4, sidestepping the tactics with knight takes d5, keeping the pressure on b5 with the bishop and the queen battery, and, most importantly, getting out of the pin of the bishop on h5. Now that bishop is really lonely on h5. It's pinning nothing. And that's something that Grandmaster Christensen, I think, has taken into consideration very seriously here. He doesn't view the unpinning as an immediate threat to the bishop on h5. But you'll see very soon he exchanges on f3, because it's kind of a ghost bishop on h5 now. First he secures b5 with rook to b8. I think an important lesson. Remember, you don't have to keep those pieces where they are forever once you've placed them somewhere. Be flexible. Be willing to move your piece again if necessary. Christensen plays rook b8. Defending, I think, is best. This variation can be defended. Rook b8. Now white to move rook a2. And in some lines, obviously Yermolinsky would like to double along the a file. However, in this position, Grandmaster Christensen has pressure on the e4 pawn. So it's not so simple. After bishop takes f3, you see the point of bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, black has pressure on e4, and he's preventing, at least for the time being, Yermolinsky from doubling on the a file with his pressure on the e4 pawn. I think Yermolinsky has a slight advantage here. After 19, knight takes f3, Christensen makes a useful move g6, and he's going to turn this position into a real modern Benoni with the move bishop g7. g6 also controls the f5 square. In view of any potential threats of knight h4 to f5, this is a good idea. I think here Yermolinsky can claim a slight advantage. However, it's not that easy to exploit this advantage. A takes b5, A takes b5. And now in this position, one thing to consider would be perhaps knight back to d2 to reinforce e4 and try to execute his plan to take over the a file. In any case, I think at this point, after 20 moves, we've concluded the opening. Probably close to best play for both sides in this variation. White maintains a slight advantage. Can't expect too much more. Black has managed to trade his white square bishop for a knight, common exchange also in the modern Benoni. Black's going to operate on the dark squares. He has pawns on b5 and c5 that could go forward any moment, giving him certain dynamism. White has the classic advantage of the two bishops and the spatial advantage in the center with the e4 and d5 pawns that do, however, require a certain amount of maintenance. I would assess it as slightly better for white, but a lot of game to play here. A very exciting battle between Yermolinsky and Christensen. We also saw Oniszczuk versus Gaia Megami. Let's just go back and review a little bit. Again, this variation with bishop d3, we saw d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, c5, d5, b5, Blumenfeld. Blumenfeld declined with bishop g5, and now the Havashi variation, ed, cd, d6, e4 the main line, a6, and now, I don't know what we should call this move. Let's say the logical move that deserves more credit than it gets. Bishop d3. No one has yet won a game in recorded chess history according to my databases with bishop d3, but I think the move deserves to be treated with respect. After bishop d3, bishop e7, bishop f4 is no doubt a good move. Avoiding exchanges, putting pressure on d6. This variation deserves to be played more often for white. And I think that it will be after these games between Oniszczuk and Gaia and Yermolinsky and Christensen. Black has been a bit lucky not to lose any games in this variation. I also won my own game. Let's just remember that after bishop e7, bishop f4, it's probably best to play bishop g4. Because if you play castles, as I did in my game, white can cement a nice slight advantage by preventing the active deployment of the bishop to g4 with a simple move h3. So instead of castles, let's stick with Gaiam's move, bishop g4, and play the best we can from there. This is International Master Bill Pascal signing off from part 3 of a secret opening weapon for black against one d4. Join us again very soon.